I was a massive people pleaser. And part of my drug use, I now don't think I'm an addict. I think I have severe ADHD and I was self-medicating through drugs. And part of it was I was a people pleaser. So to be around the people that I wanted to be around, I had to take drugs. That was the bottom line. If I wanted to have fun and be in London and be in the cool set, whatever, I would take drugs. And when I didn't, I was isolated. And the only way that I could change that was moving out of London and going to the countryside and putting everything into my family. And that's what I did. And that was 20 years ago.
Welcome to All Aboard, where we help parents navigate the ADHD journey. Whether you're at the beginning of this journey asking what now, or you've trodden this path for a while and are wondering what's next, All Aboard ADHD is here for you. We will bring you key information from expert interviews, inspiring special guest stories, and parents sharing their real life lived experience to help you feel less alone. I'm Claire, and today we'll be talking to special guest Pearl Lowe. Pearl is a designer, author, and former musician, known for her signature vintage style and her love of creating beautiful, characterful spaces. In the 1990s, Pearl fronted the indie bands Powder and Lodger before turning her creative energy to design. From fashion and interiors to a series of best-selling books, including her latest, Faded Glamour in the City. After years of living at full speed, Pearl was diagnosed with ADHD. A diagnosis, she says, finally helped her make sense of her past and her struggles with addiction, whilst also shining a light on her creativity, sensitivity and emotional depth. Pearl has 4 children and is married to Danny Goffrey, drummer and backing vocalist with Supergrass. She channels her energy into her family, her interiors work and her writing, bringing her signature sense of faded glamour and individuality into everything she creates. In this episode, we talk about Pearl's ADHD journey, the link between creativity and chaos, and how understanding her own mind has helped her find calm, connection and purpose both at home and in her work. Pearl is here to share her ADHD story with us today. Welcome aboard, Pearl.
Hiya, nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too. Thank you so much for joining us today. So can you begin by telling us about when you were diagnosed with ADHD? I guess what led you to that diagnosis and how it feels now that you've got that answer.
Well, it was quite a few years ago. It was in lockdown and I was kind of doing one of those online quizzes, completely oblivious to the fact that I might even have this condition. I just went online, answered it completely truthfully, and then it said, that I had severe ADHD. So I was like, oh, that's really mental. Like, I've never been told I've got ADHD. I've never been told I have any kind of condition. And obviously, when you have something like ADHD, you let things slip. You let things sort of go on for years. You don't do anything about things. And so one day I was at a sort of local swimming bath place, and a friend of mine said, oh, I've just been diagnosed with ADHD. And I was like, I think I've got it. And she said, yeah, I absolutely, 100% you've got it, Pearl. And I was like, oh. And she said, well, look, here's the number of my doctor. Because, that time it was sort of years and years of, waiting on the NHS. And she said, look, he's amazing. And he works out of the Charter Nightingale Clinic. So anyway, I went to go and see him. And yeah, I've got ADHD. And this was a few years ago. So it took me, I don't know, maybe 3 years to actually go and get a diagnosis. And then 3 years ago, I was diagnosed.
And how did it feel when you got that diagnosis?
I felt really sad. At first, I felt very emotional because I felt that had I had known, then perhaps my life would have been much easier. I've definitely been, had quite a difficult childhood, difficult teenage years, difficult early adult years. And I feel that if I'd have known what I know now, then life would have been very different. So I felt sad for my former years,
Yeah, I think that's very common, isn't it? The initial sort of relief at the explanation and then just grief and sadness when you start to almost look back at your life. And in that sense, then you mentioned then that you'd had a difficult childhood and your teenage years, sort of early adult years. So if you think back to those times in your life now through that ADHD lens, how does having that diagnosis help you make sense of the experiences that you had and what happened to you?
So I struggled at school. I excelled in the subjects that I loved, which were kind of English, history, and religious studies, weirdly. And then all the other subjects, it was like being in a foreign country. It was just, they didn't interest me. And this led to me, starting to not turn up at school and not, kind of thinking that I wasn't going to pass any exams and not even taking them, so that led when I was 16 to me just working in awful jobs, because I'm actually not someone who can work underneath somebody. I'm a creative, but because I wasn't, kind of skilled in art or any of the subjects that, kind of are laid out in a generic school, mine is more visual. So obviously, you don't really know that at that age. So it was just, well, I'm not really good at anything. What am I supposed to do in life? I knew I wanted to be something in the arts and maybe a singer or an actress or something. But then I didn't really know how to go about that. So I spent many years just, working in a shoe shop for a few weeks and then thinking, gosh, this is awful, I'm leaving, and just terrible. And then I just kind of never had any money, and my parents were always having a go at me, and, and I just didn't think I belonged anywhere, and I think as a result, I got into drugs because I just was self-medicating my condition through drugs and not alcohol, drugs, so it was just a really hard time, really.
Yeah, that's a particularly hard time. And I want to talk to you much more about the journey that you've had through addiction. But you said something there and I thought it was so powerful, that sense that you just didn't belong anywhere. Like,
Yeah.
what can you remember what that felt like? Because I think this is a real challenge, isn't it, for particularly children and young people with ADHD, this complete lack of self-esteem, because all of our experiences through school and everything's happened today have led us to this sense that we're not good at anything.
Exactly. And I think that now, knowing what I know now, in the sense that I kind of, I love creating beautiful spaces, that at that time, how would I know that then? Do you know what I mean? Like, it was like, I loved, decorating my bedroom or, making things look pretty. And I was really into clothes. I was really into fashion, not so much fashion, but vintage. And in those days, it was called secondhand, and people didn't really, appreciate it. It was like you're wearing someone else's stuff. It was really, my mum used to throw away my vintage because she thought it was disgusting. And she's got terrible OCD. So she was just like, she'd get hold of it and put it in a bin, and I'd be so upset, but, and that obviously has become my career. But at that time, I didn't know that was, something that I was skilled in, so it was just like, so I felt a massive sense of that I had two older brothers that were academics. They were straight A students. Then they went on to law school, and one's a KC now, one's a corporate, senior partner at Michigan Dureo in London, the law firm. And they used to just sort of we're a very close family, but they did sort of slightly just go, oh, my sister, she's mad, she's in a world of her own. She's quite, she's off her rocker, and that would really upset me. They'd sort of call me, stupid and all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, it was tough.
We start to internalize those things, don't we? I think children, when we receive these messages, they're stories, and then we start to believe it about ourselves. And to your point, that actually the things that you like doing then are actually things that have become not just a passion, but your career in later life. We can't understand that in ourselves when we're children if we haven't got people who are helping us understand the strengths and why there's value in those things, because so much emphasis is placed on the struggles and the challenges, particularly, unfortunately, through school, and the value of academic results, as you said about, your brothers being straight A students. So what do you think, looking back, that you wish your parents or even teachers, because you talked about school, had understood about you then? And what difference would that have made?
I think that even still, we're so behind with ADHD and autism. And if you think about sort of America, or, we don't have the funding in this country as well. But I do feel obviously this was a long time ago. So, I don't remember anyone having ADHD. I remember it being something perhaps, certainly when my children were little, it was something that young boys had, because I remember taking my youngest son to have a diagnosis for Asperger's. because that was something that because he was he was a very difficult child, and he didn't like anybody, and he was always, kind of, go away, I hate you. And I just thought that he had some behavioral problems, but I took him to see somebody and they said, no, he doesn't have Asperger's. And that just baffled me, because I was like, okay, well, what is wrong with him then? You know what I mean? But I now think that he actually does have ADHD, and that he's on a waiting list at the moment with the NHS. And certainly my youngest daughter, as a result of me getting my diagnosis, she went and got hers. But she was 16. It was great because it was just before her exams, and she was able to take them in a room with headphones, extra time, and she's now got medication, and she is sailing through life. And I do feel that had that have been me when I was her age or younger, none of the hardship that I had gone through would have existed. Do you know what I mean? It would have been it would have been a completely different story.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think what you're saying resonates probably just about to everyone listening, but also not just for ourselves as adults, if we've gone through that late diagnosis process like you have, like I have. But then when we think about our children, because you're right, we haven't really evolved that much. I mean, obviously, yes, we do have more awareness, and thankfully more and more children and people are being diagnosed to be able to get the support that they need, as you mentioned, for your daughter. But yet it's still so heavily stigmatized and misunderstood. And exactly the example you gave with your daughter, that we really end up having to focus all of this around the accommodations necessary through school. And because it has such a profound impact on how we feel about ourselves and as we go through that journey. And I think the example with your daughter is a really interesting one too, because obviously we're talking about girls here, and ADHD in girls and women, it's so often overlooked. Particularly, as we've said, both of us being diagnosed later in life. How do you think, being a girl and your gender in that sense shaped your experience that you had both as a child and how you were understood?
The thing is that I'm only getting understood now. That's the thing. My family, ever since I've had my diagnosis, and now, right, that's why you always forget birthdays, or you don't turn up at the wrong venues, or we got the wrong, you get everything wrong. That's the problem, is that, I was always berated for everything that I did that was wrong, so, that now my family and my mum as well, my mum's like, oh, now, because I get dates wrong, I get things muddled up, so, we turn up at an airport on the, 5 hours earlier because I get the wrong time, or, so we'd have to sit there for 5 hours, or I get the wrong day, or I'd book the wrong flight or the wrong destination, or we turn up at weddings on the wrong night. And, my family now are much more accepting of my choices. So now they say, Mum, can we have a look, at the ticket? Can we? So now I just send everyone everything so that is avoided, But, things I lost my license a few years ago because I thought I had 6 points and I didn't. I had 9. And I had one of those, where I could have done a speed awareness. And I thought, no, I'm too busy to do a speed awareness. I'm just going to send off the check and I'm just going to have some more points. And then little did I know that the next letter was, you're going to court, So those sorts of things that one would go on the DVLA and check, I didn't. So I don't check things. It's too much for my brain. So I just sign things, and I sign contracts without even looking at them. And I have a brother who's a lawyer who just literally, I hear his voice in my head going, what have you signed now? Like, I am a lawyer. Give me the contract. So I sign away my designs and I let people use them for free and things like that. So my life is always a struggle. I mean, I remember when I lived in London 20 years ago, and I don't like brown envelopes, so I just wouldn't open them. And then suddenly it would be like £2,000 worth of parking fines, that I hadn't looked at. All these things could be avoided, but I just don't. It's too much for me to look. It's a weird one. I have these blocks where I can't deal. And a normal person wouldn't have that. And that's what I found.
I think those blocks are very real, and all the things you're referring to, and people would talk these days so much about an ADHD tax, and you can hear how you're paying that, but they have such deep root causes. All of that stuff begins way before the brown envelope comes through your door or you haven't read something. And I think they're so rooted in, and this is why I asked the question about gender in that sense of how we see ourselves and how we value ourselves, particularly as we're growing up, and the role that we have to play. That you said about giving away your designs for free, and it can be very difficult to see the value in ourselves when that hasn't been, I guess, supported and encouraged and developed for us when we're much younger as girls. And I can see that happening even still today in the way that many young girls mask, and that's certainly something I've had to learn about myself. I think I'm still unpicking, and sometimes I'm not even entirely sure where the mask starts and stops, because it becomes so much a part of who you are.
Yeah, we mask massively. I mean, as a woman, as a child, as a young girl, we mask, and I guess boys and men don't do that as much. I feel that I'm always like, I can do this. I want to be like really strong, and so I don't ask for help. That's another thing. I never ever want anyone's help. But as a result of that, I get myself in terrible situations,
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I can relate to that. I'm very, very bad for asking for help. And actually, when I get into situations where I'm really overwhelmed, I only have myself to blame, because I think I've done this to myself. Like, my inherent people pleasing means that I'm just saying yes constantly and getting myself into these situations. So we do mask. We absolutely mask, because that's very much about being accepted, isn't it? We want to conform, and then when we're not being accepted, sometimes there are other ways in which that we cope with that. And you've been really open about your history of addiction and your journey to getting clean. And I loved something that I read about, a life-changing bit of advice you were given, which was to change your playground. I thought that's so significant, particularly the role that environment plays with ADHD. So why was changing your playground, why was changing your environment so important to that, and what impacted moving from London to Somerset have on you?
I was a massive people pleaser, and part of my drug use, I now don't think I'm an addict. I think I have severe ADHD, and I was self-medicating through drugs. And part of it was I was a people pleaser. So to be around the people that I wanted to be around, I had to take drugs. That was the bottom line. That if I wanted to have fun and be in London and be in the cool set, whatever, I would take drugs. And when I didn't, I was isolated. And the only way that I could, sort of change that was moving out of London and going to the countryside and putting everything into my family. That's what I did. And that was 20 years ago. And it was the best thing I ever did, because then my children weren't being let down by me. I was literally there. I was a full-time mum. I was doing the school runs. And I mean, yes, I missed things because of my ADHD, things like dance recitals or whatever it was that they were doing at that time. Just I was missing some key things. I mean, not all of them, but some of them. But generally, my life turned around the minute I moved to Somerset. And it was the fact that, I met some lovely people. I met people that weren't using, that were healthy, that weren't in ego. They were just, wanting to be good mums and, whatnot. And it was just great. And so that was it. But I wasn't well. I wasn't well until much later. So even though I was sober, I there was a missing link.
And by saying you weren't well and that missing link, are you referring to then going on to have your ADHD diagnosis? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, because, I got sober thinking, oh yeah, everything's going to be great, but I have this condition, and this condition is really serious. And it's only since I've learned that I have it that I can make steps towards healing, forgiving, do you know what I mean? Getting rid of shame, all that kind of stuff. It's been a revelation for me.
Yeah, I very much understand what you're saying. I think it may well be, certainly in my experience, like a lifelong journey, that stuff, because there's so much to understand about yourself. And every single day there'll be things that come to mind and think, oh, that's why. And I think that may possibly never stop as we try to understand ourselves so much through this lens. You talked about the fact that you moved to Somerset and suddenly you immersed yourself in your family and you became a full-time mum, and you were surrounded by people who were healthy and not using. And what's interesting there is, as I'm listening to you speak, and the fact that you didn't have the understanding you've got of yourself now. It's so much about removing the distraction, isn't it? It's so much about removing the pull of something else in that environment, which is so significant. And I think it's something that is actually not really understood enough, how significant the role environment is on our ADHD. If we're talking about children on their ADHD, that might be the classroom, that might be where you live, that might be who you hang around with, that might be how you set yourself up to work. And all of those things, if we're not in the right environment, really adds to those challenges and make things more of a struggle than perhaps they need to be. And I'm just thinking about, you touched on some of these things, those struggles that you had when you were a child, but I'm wondering, now that you have this understanding about yourself, are there struggles that you had when you were younger that you actually now in the context of your life see as a strength?
I was always very strong and my gut was very strong, which I've carried through my life. Unfortunately, when you take drugs, you aren't in a good headspace, so your gut isn't very strong, so you make some bad choices. But generally, I think as a child, I was very aware of what I wanted to do and what I didn't want to do, and that's the same now. So sort of, and sometimes, so that's one of my biggest strengths, is that I'm my own person. I'm not really a people pleaser anymore. I was, and I don't know if it's life choices or I've just got older and wiser and, thank God I'm not a people pleaser, because that was one of my biggest weaknesses that I was as a child. I'd do what anyone ever said, do you know what I mean? Like in the kind of just to please people, but now I don't do that anymore.
How did you stop that? And I'm asking out of genuine personal interest, because this is still something that I struggle with now. So what do you think changed for you?
I don't really know if it was a gradual thing. It was more that I had to live empty for a while and I had one friend when I left London, and she's still my best mate and I love her dearly. But yeah, just sort of then I kind of had to slowly make friends again, and so when I made friends, it was kind of like on my terms, in the sense that, I was very picky and I kind of would go for people that had good hearts and, just didn't really want anything particularly from me. They just liked me for who I am as a person rather than what I could do for them. And I think it was that, really, just slowly meeting people that were kind of kind and that kind of lived the same sort of life as I did. Yeah, because I've been quite hurt when I left London. And I thought, right, I'm not going to get myself in this situation anymore. I'm only going to be around people that I trust and that I value. And actually, I just thought, you know what, I've got my family and that's the most important thing. And I'm not going to, I can't give up anything for them.
Yeah, an interesting use of the word trust there, because as I was listening to you, I was thinking actually in part it's about learning to trust yourself again too, isn't it? Because you mentioned the gut element earlier, that you're not really trusting your gut and the decisions that you're making that perhaps led you to a certain point. So as you living empty in the way that you described it and rebuilding it with friends around you that liked you for who you were and building trust in them, I guess you're building trust in yourself too at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. I mean, it is one of the big things about ADHD, isn't it? I was so trusting of everybody until they crossed me. And then I'd be so shocked because I just would be like, oh my God, I really thought they were my friends. It's that thing of just being so open and then being so vulnerable and open to being hurt. And so once you get completely stung and you think, okay, that's it now, you almost have, which I didn't really want to have, but you almost have a sort of hardened exterior, because of the pain that you've been through, but like I said, I'm lucky because I do have a very close family. I'm very close to my mum. I'm very close to my best friend. My family, my kids are great. They're now adults. So, I speak to each of them every single day. And if they're not at home, rather, and my husband, and, I'm lucky because he is my best friend. So it's kind of, I don't really need anyone else,
Such an amazing thing, isn't it? Actually, when you talk about it in that way, it's really all we need in life. And it's so inspiring, I think, to know that that's the relationship you've got with your family, but particularly your children now they're grown up too. Because obviously a lot of people listen to this, their children are younger. My children are 14 and 10. And that's really what I aspire to. Someone asked me the other day what I look forward to. And the first thing that came to mind was enjoying adult relationships with them, when we're out of this stage, but perhaps in that sweet spot before they've got too many of their own responsibilities, and you just really get to enjoy them at a time that they actively want to spend that time with you, because I guess everything that we do now is about building that relationship with them, or the foundations for it as they get older. And you said something as well that I just wanted to pick up on, and that was doing things on your own terms. And you also talked about your strength in terms of kind of always being your own person. And I'm just thinking about that in relation to what you talked about at the beginning, not realizing that maybe some of the things you were good at, like decorating your bedroom or the clothes and the vintage inspiration that you had in that time. So your creativity feels like it's a very shining strength that is sort of defining one that goes right the way through your life in many, many aspects. And I wonder, how has that sense of holding on to doing things your way helped you achieve what you have today?
It's definitely, I've gone about it in a kind of roundabout way without realizing it, really, because I sort of, I fell into all my careers. So basically, I wanted to be a singer, and my aspirations were really small. I just wanted to play Reading Festival. It's so weird. I was just a kind of, I'd play all these venues, and suddenly there was all this buzz about our band, and we were on tour with like bands like The Verve and Elastica and all these mad 90s bands, and we were sort of on this Britpop special program, and then suddenly we had this big deal on, in front on our laps, and I was thinking, gosh, because I already had a daughter at that point. I had my daughter Daisy, so I didn't really want to be in this big band that was touring around the world, because I was leaving her behind with my mum, and I was just like, this is wrong. And it was kind of weird because I wanted a way out, and when I fell into designing, it was simply because I couldn't. We bought our first house in Camden, and I was kind of decorating it, and I found this sort of lace for the window in the bathroom, and I dyed it this wonderful pink color. And then all my friends asked for if they could have one, and then the Cross shop, which was in Notting Hill, asked if they could stock them, and then suddenly it became this big business. And so I fell into design literally by default. And the same thing happened when I left London. I couldn't find, because I put on a stone in weight, and I couldn't find any dresses that fitted my new shape, because I was so skinny when I was in London. And suddenly I was designing my own dresses, which then then I was in Liberties, stocking my lovely black lace dresses that I had designed, so, and then Peacock saw them and said, could you do a 3-year collab with us? And so it was all just sort of, I don't know, just very organic and very, like you said, my own. I'd created this career, but it was very much on my own terms. I didn't have to do, fashion sort of shows, twice a year. And, I didn't have to sort of answer to anyone. I just found my own local dressmakers to make them. And that was that, So it was kind of weird.
Completely following your own path in that sense, right? And as you say, kind of falling into it. And that's something that resonates with me, looking back, I think about my own life and the path that I've had, and even how I got here to be doing this podcast. I feel like many times I've perhaps what was initially looking for a way out of something, or at a point in my life where I perhaps wasn't sure what to do next. Say your example that you said when you moved to Somerset and you couldn't find any dresses that fitted. It's interesting, isn't it, how sometimes the path can open up in front of us if we're sort of willing to follow it, if we're curious enough. And that's such a ADHD strength as well, isn't it? And I think a really common theme that will relate to a lot of people. We hear so many very successful creatives and entrepreneurs have got ADHD, and I think it's for a reason. It's because we have that sense in us, and we're curious and we're creative, and we kind of want to see what happens. We want to explore things a little bit. And you talk about something in the intro of your new book, which I really liked, because your new interiors book takes you back to the city. So we've obviously been in London and moved to Somerset, and this book has taken you back again. And you talk about having itchy feet, which feels like it resonates with what you were saying. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about that and what being back in London today brings you at this sort of chapter.
So I think in lockdown, I wanted to move from Somerset, and I wanted a change. But at that point, my daughter was still at school. My youngest was still at school, and I still had two boys living at home as well. So it was just a little bit like, couldn't really do it. So what I said to my husband was like, why don't we just buy a little place by the beach? Because I really missed the sea when I was in lockdown. You know that thing where you were just craving something? I was craving the sea. So we bought this little house on the beach near Hastings, actually, weirdly. And it's just such a random, but it was 4 hours away from Somerset. And we bought it in a business so that we could rent it out and, use it a little bit, but mainly rent it out. And it became a bit of a bind, actually, with people ringing us up saying the boiler's broken, and we're not landlords. So we were just like, driving 4 hours to, sort of turn on a hot water tap or something, ridiculous like that. And so that was my itchy feet. It was like almost like, we would have moved had it not been the kids, because we would have moved areas, And but what was great was we had it for a few years, and then we made quite a nice profit on it. And with the money, we bought a flat in London. And it was about that time when my daughter was just going to university, and we were able to think of our next move. And the next move was, we want a bit of action. We're both in our 50s. We're both, kind of not retired, but felt like we were, because our children had gone. And we weren't doing school runs anymore. I've been doing school runs for 33 years. So this was just like, wow. Okay, listen, what do I want for myself? I want to go and see bands play. I want to go and, where it's on my doorstep, so I can go to galleries, or I can go to, sort of like, I love the V&A, just things like that. So that's where I was at that point, and my husband. So we bought it in November last year. I mentioned it to my publisher, who then said, right, we're shooting the book. And I was like, it's not ready. I haven't even signed the contract yet. It was all like that. So we took a few months, and suddenly the book was being shot in March, so unfinished. But anyway, it was great.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it kind of goes full circle, where you obviously started out in London, had that period in Somerset, and, as you said, got itchy feet, but perhaps at a time when you couldn't move. But how much like what you're describing in terms of the various experiences you had from a work perspective led you to where you are now. It almost sounds like actually where you've lived, and, the experience of wanting to buy somewhere by the sea, and even that has led you to full circle, bringing you straight back to London.
Yeah.
Because at a time in your life, and I was smiling when you were speaking, because I was thinking, I was trying to imagine myself, I'm not there yet. But I love this idea of getting to that stage. My son's 14 and my daughter's 10. So it's a little way off for me. But as you say, in my 50s, being able to really enjoy that next bit where you've still young, you've still got loads of energy, and you want to kind of be able to do all those things that perhaps you had to put on hold, I guess, particularly if you're rediscovering yourself and you're understanding yourself, and at the same time doing it at a point where your children have grown up, they've moved on, whether that's to university or living their own lives. But as a mum yourself, thinking about your children, how has understanding your own ADHD changed the way you think about parenting, or indeed how you connect with them now? Because I know you mentioned, you talked about your son likely having ADHD, and that the fact that your daughter went on to get an ADHD diagnosis herself. But how's that changed your view of your relationship with them and how you connect with them?
I think, weirdly, I actually think they've all got ADHD, which is really, I know they've all got something anyway. So in a way, we understand each other, and I can help them a lot. That's what's great about having that diagnosis, is the fact that, I can say, look, don't be so impatient, with so many things, with work, with, their relationships, just, especially my youngest daughter, because she is a carbon copy of me. And it's so, obviously for me, it's awful to watch, because I'm like, but she's super smart. She hasn't got that thing where I was only interested in 3 subjects. She's so intelligent that she's a little bit different. I think she'll go a little bit further in life than me, maybe. But it is great. It's great because I can pass on so much knowledge, and I can, give them advice, which I guess is great for them. But I feel sorry that, that I've passed on this gene. I just sometimes go, oh man, but I guess you can't say, oh, if only I'd known, because you know what I mean? Like, I just don't want to put it on anyone. That's all.
Yeah, I get that. But I think the amazing thing is that actually, and you said about this gene, that's who you are. And it's why you have been able to achieve so many amazing things. And it's also why you've had undoubtedly some really big challenges in life.
Yeah.
But the joy of being able to do what we do now with our children is that we can give them the understanding that we didn't have. And you said about your daughter that she's likely to go on to do amazing things and perhaps better than us. And sometimes I think that's the whole point, isn't it? That we want to like elevate them, and that we want them to be able to move beyond the challenges that perhaps we can't, because they've got the support and the understanding that we didn't have.
Yeah.
And all of these things add to really changing the narrative, because with ADHD undoubtedly comes very, very real struggles. And you've talked so openly about those, but with it are also amazing strengths. And I think, that creativity, passion, drive, curiosity, all those things we've talked about today, we need people like that in the world, right? Those are the change makers. And I think if we can really understand the way in which ADHD shows up for us as individuals, because it is so individual, and how the environment plays such a big part in that, then we can start to, shape a world and a way in which we can really thrive and like bring out the best in us. And it sounds like that's exactly what you've been able to do for your children.
No, absolutely. No, it's been great in that sense. It's been great for me. I can't begin to tell you how grateful I am for that diagnosis. Life, I'm not saying life is a bed of roses right now. It's not. I still get, I've got something going on at the moment, which is really horrible, with a brand. And, could it have been avoided? Possibly. I don't know. But, I'm so sensitive. I do find life quite a challenge. I just do. And, but then I learn so much as well, and I love the fact that, I know some people think, my husband gets so angry with me when I do interviews, because he says, you're too open, Pearl. You're just like an open book. But I feel like I need, come on, like, I have a little bit of a profile. I can actually help. I can actually, and I do, because I wrote a book in 2007 called All That Glitters. And it was about my struggle as a mother with addiction. I had serious problems with drugs. And, I wrote that book, and I still get letters today from people who have read it saying, thank you, I'm now sober, and blah, blah, blah. And, it's just fantastic. I love it. I get DMs and all sorts. And, I think, well, gosh, I've helped quite a lot of people through that book. And yes, it was annoying for a while, because I was called a junkie for, I can't even remember how many years, even like, I'd turn up at a new school, and the mums would be sort of staring at me, and thinking I was a drug addict or whatever. But I still am happy that I got to help lots of people. So, but that's part of ADHD. You're so open. You're an open book, And but I can't change who I am.
And you know what? Nor should you, because that openness is exactly what helps other people. And I found exactly the same to be true doing this podcast. It's the openness and the honesty that people so desperately need, and that they relate to when they feel so alone, and they look around them and they can't see people struggling in the way they are, or they don't dare admit things through, fear of shame or embarrassment. And hearing somebody else be brave enough, because there's so much bravery and courage it takes to do that. Like, we might instinctively be open, maybe at times too open, but it is also an immensely brave thing to do. And you're helping so many people in the process, and not just through your book, All That Glitters, in terms of addiction, but, people listening to this today, knowing that there are other people further along this journey than themselves who've had these challenges and are able to change things both for themselves and their children. And I'm just thinking, for the parents that are listening on this ADHD journey, who kind of wish they had that crystal ball that almost you've got now, what positive message or piece of advice would you like to give them?
If you think you've got it, there are ways. Get yourself on an NHS list, or even I've heard that there's a great way through Right to Choose, or go to your GP. I really think, honestly, start with that. Just go and get your diagnosis. And when you do, or when you have your diagnosis, there's lots of trained counselors out there that can help. And also be kind to yourself, because I think that's the one thing about having ADHD. We beat ourselves up all the time. We have we're just so much shame, and, just you go into a bit of a black hole for a while and whatever, but you just got to, give yourself a break, because that's another thing. I'm always I don't need anyone to say nasty things about me, because I say the worst things about myself, I just literally go in on myself sometimes. And so it's tough having this condition. I can't bear it when I read these articles where they say, oh, it's the new handbag. It's like, this is a serious condition. You don't develop it. You're born with it. It's a massive struggle. I was told I was an addict. Actually, I read somewhere that there's 80% of addicts have ADHD. And actually, if you treated the ADHD more than the addiction, then I think you'd be a lot happier, but this is very early days on all of these things, all the correlations between the two. That's such early days. And we're in a society where it's just sort of, we're not in the box, are we? we're sort of outside
Definitely
the box,
not.
Which is hard. It's hard being outside the box, but there are groups, there's help, there's charities, there's all sorts that, I would suggest starting with the diagnosis.
Yeah, and there's using your voice, which you're doing so amazingly today. And thank you for sharing your story with us, because I think you're right, like being kind, it seems like something so simple, and yet it is so hard. And I'm listening to you, and so many of the things you said today are things I very, very personally can relate to. I beat myself up all the time. It's almost like that message of not being good enough that probably started very young. It stays with us, and we have to work really, really hard for that, doesn't it? Like you said, you don't need other people to say things about you, because you could say them yourself, which is why I think diagnosis is so important, particularly with children, because the earlier we can intervene, the earlier we can help support them so that they don't have those same implications as they grow up. So Pearl, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Honestly, and you too. It's been really lovely chatting to you. And it's so lovely chatting to people who understand this condition more than anything else, because it is, like we said, we're such early days, but yeah. And also, it's kind of, sometimes it's sort of brushed aside as something trivial, and it isn't, so thank you.
It's really, really not trivial. And as you said, and I liked the way you described it about it's like the new handbag, you think it's really, really not, is it? This is something that when people are seeking help, it's because they need help, not because they're jumping on some sort of bandwagon. I think the fact that we have these conversations and that we raise awareness is a really powerful thing, because despite what the media says, there still is massive underdiagnosis. And so thank you for being really honest. Thank you for sharing your story with us today, because I know that you've helped me even listening to you, and I know that you'll have helped lots of other people too. So thank you, Pearl.
Oh, thank you. Have a lovely day. Thank you so much.
If you'd like to find out more about Pearl and to buy a copy of her new interiors book, Faded Glamour in the City, then please do check out our show notes below for more information. Or if you'd like to find out about how I can help support you and your children with personalised ADHD coaching, then please do head to allaboardadhd.com. You can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at allaboardadhd. Most importantly, if you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, please can you follow and review All Aboard wherever you're listening today to help other parents find this podcast and welcome them aboard our journey too. Thank you for listening to All Aboard ADHD.